The captain's voice cut across the flight line like a siren. "Hey, you, get away from that aircraft." The old man in the worn flight jacket did not run. He simply stood there, 10 feet from the F-35 Lightning II, his eyes fixed on the cockpit as if he were seeing something no one else could see. His hands hung motionless at his sides, but they were positioned strangely, fingers curved as though resting on controls that existed only in memory. What Captain Bradley Vance did not know, what no one at that airshow knew, was that those weathered hands had once saved the entire Joint Strike Fighter program from destruction at 400 knots in an uncontrolled descent over the Mojave Desert. Captain Vance crossed the tarmac with the aggressive stride of a man who had found his purpose for the day. The airshow had been running perfectly. Media coverage was excellent. VIP guests were impressed. And now this. Some homeless vagrant had slipped past the security perimeter and was standing on his flight line, contaminating the pristine image he had spent 6 months cultivating. I said, "Get away from that aircraft." Vance's voice carried across the demonstration area, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "This is a restricted military installation, not a shelter." The old man turned slowly. His face was weathered and lined, tanned by years of exposure to elements that had nothing to do with beaches or vacations. His flight jacket was so faded that the patches were barely visible, threadbare at the cuffs and collar, held together more by habit than by thread. His boots were cracked and worn, one sole separating at the toe. He looked exactly like what Captain Vance assumed he was, a vagrant, a trespasser, a problem to be solved. But his eyes told a different story. When they met Vance's gaze, there was no fear in them. No scham, no dos pedastion. There was something else entirely, something that looked almost like recognition. "I apologize, sir." The old man's voice was quiet, hoarse from disuse, but there was precision in it, an economy of words that suggested a lifetime of saying exactly what was necessary and nothing more. "I just wanted to see her up close." "One more time." Vance laughed, a sharp bark designed to be heard by the spectators now gathering at the security barrier. "Her. You hear that, folks?" He gestured broadly toward the F-35 Lightning II gleaming in the afternoon sun. "The homeless gentleman thinks the aircraft is a woman." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. Families with children, military personnel in dress uniforms, media representatives with cameras. All of them watching now. The old man did not respond to the mockery. His attention had drifted back to the aircraft, his eyes tracing lines that seemed invisible to everyone else. The slight modification to the weapons bay doors. The updated sensor array configuration. The way the canopy caught the light at exactly the angle he remembered from 1,000 hours of pre-flight inspections. His hands moved slightly at his sides. Unconscious movements. The ghost of a control stick. The phantom of a throttle. "Hey!" Vance snapped his fingers in front of the old man's face. "I'm talking to you. How did you get past the perimeter? Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you are in right now?" "I walk, sir." The old man's response was matter of fact. "There is a gap in the fence line approximately 200 meters east of the main gate. The drainage culvert. It has been there since 1987. Vance's eyes narrowed. "And how would you know that?" The old man said nothing. His gaze remained fixed on the aircraft. A security detail was approaching now. 2 armed airmen with serious expressions. Vance waved them over, his voice rising for maximum theatrical effect. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly why we have security protocols. You never know what kind of person might wander onto a military installation." He turned back to the old man with undisguised contempt. "Look at yourself. When was the last time you had a shower? A meal that did not come from a dumpster?" The old man absorbed the insults without visible reaction. His posture had shifted almost imperceptibly, shoulders drawing back, spine straightening. It was subtle enough that no one noticed. No one except perhaps the crew chief working on a nearby aircraft, who paused with a wrench in his hand and watched with sudden interest. That jacket. Vance reached out and grabbed the collar of the old man's flight jacket, pulling it open to examine the faded patches. "Let me guess. Found this in a surplus store? Or maybe behind a recruiting office?" "It was issued to me, sir." "Right." Vance released the jacket with a dismissive shove. And I suppose you're going to tell me you actually flew something. Let me guess. Helicopters in Vietnam? Every homeless vet claims Vietnam these days. The old man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. No, sir. Not helicopters. The security detail had arrived. One of the airmen reached for the old man's arm, but Vance held up a hand. Wait, I want to hear this. He crossed his arms and smiled the smile of a man who knew he was about to enjoy himself. So tell me, hero, what exactly did you fly? The old man was silent for a long moment. His eyes moved one more time across the F-35, drinking in every line, every angle, every modification that had been made since he last sat in a cockpit. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I flew that. Vance's laughter echoed across the tarmac. You flew an F-35. A homeless man in a 30-year-old jacket flew a fifth-generation stealth fighter. Not the F-35, sir. The old man's voice remained quiet, but something in it had changed. A weight had entered it, a gravity that seemed to pull the air tight around his words. The prototype, the X-35. I was there when she was born. The crowd murmured. Somewhere in the VIP section, a woman in a flight suit had stopped walking and turned to watch. Vance shook his head, still grinning. The X-35. Sure, and I had dinner with the president last week. He turned to the security detail. Get this lunatic off my flight line, and find out how he knew about that drainage culvert. Someone is getting written up today. The airmen moved forward, each taking one of the old man's arms. He did not resist. He simply stood there, allowing himself to be handled, his eyes never leaving the aircraft that carried 30 years of his life in every rivet and wire. And as they began to lead him away, Captain Bradley Vance made the mistake that would end his career. Hey, homeless hero. His voice dripped with contempt, pitched loud enough for every camera and every spectator to capture. If you really flew the prototype, go ahead. Fly it. Show us what you have got, test pilot. The old man stopped walking. The airman felt the change in his body, a sudden stillness that made them both uneasy without understanding why. And somewhere in the crowd, Lieutenant Colonel Miranda Chun began pushing her way toward the front, her heart pounding with the impossible suspicion that she knew exactly who she was looking at. The smell of jet fuel hung in the air, and Walter Jameson was no longer standing on a tarmac in the summer heat. He was 20 years younger, walking across the scorched concrete of Edwards Air Force Base with the morning sun at his back and the future of American air power waiting in a hangar ahead. The X-35 had been beautiful in the way that only experimental aircraft can be beautiful. Not polished, not refined, but alive with possibility. He remembered the first time he had climbed into that cockpit, the way the seat had molded to his body like it had been waiting for him, the way his hands had found the controls with the certainty of a man coming home. 340 test flights, more than any other pilot in the program. Every one of them logged in his memory with the precision of a flight recorder. Margaret had been there for most of them, standing at the observation window with her hand pressed against the glass, watching him disappear into the sky and waiting for him to come back. She never said she was afraid. She never asked him to stop. She simply stood there, bearing witness, loving him in the particular way that only a pilot's wife can love. And now Margaret was gone, 8 years in the ground, and Walter was standing on a strange tarmac with security guards gripping his arms and a captain's laughter ringing in his ears. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. And if stories like this one about courage, sacrifice, and second chances speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten heroes among us. Now, let us continue. The security airmen had loosened their grip slightly, uncertain how to proceed. The old man was not resisting. He was not even acknowledging them. He simply stood there, swaying almost imperceptibly, his eyes focused on something far beyond the aircraft in front of him. Walter's mind drifted to the day everything changed. Not the famous flight, not the save that would be studied in test pilot schools for decades. The other day, the one that mattered more. Margaret had been diagnosed on a Tuesday. Ovarian cancer. Stage 4. The doctor's voice had been gentle, professional, practiced in the delivery of devastation. Walter had sat in that sterile office with his wife's hand in his, and for the first time in his life, he had faced a problem that could not be solved with skill or courage or the precise application of training. 2 years. That was what they gave her. She made it 18 months. He had been her caregiver at the end. The man who had kept his voice steady while an aircraft screamed toward the desert floor could not keep his voice steady when he changed her bandages. The hands that had executed a perfect inverted recovery at 4,000 feet had trembled when they held the morphine dropper. And when she finally slipped away, when the house went quiet and the condolence cards stopped coming and the casseroles stopped appearing on the doorstep, Walter Jameson had looked at his daughter Rebecca and seen Margaret's face staring back at him. He could not bear it. The note had been brief. 3 sentences. I love you. I am sorry. Do not look for me. 7 years ago. 7 years of shelters and underpasses and library computers where he tracked Rebecca's career from a distance. She had finished her doctorate, aerospace engineering. She had gone to work for Lockheed Martin, the same company that had built the X-35. His daughter was working on his aircraft, carrying forward a legacy she did not know she had inherited. He had seen her name on the contractor list at the airshow entrance. Dr. Rebecca Jameson Park. She had gotten married. He had not been there. She was here today, somewhere in the VIP section, and he had come not to be seen, but simply to be near her, to breathe the same air, to watch from the shadows one more time. The security guards were speaking to him now, but the words did not register. Walter reached into the pocket of his flight jacket with the slow, deliberate movement of a man who knows he's being watched by nervous people with weapons. Easy. One of the airmen tensed. Keep your hands where we can see them. Walter withdrew a worn leather wallet. He opened it carefully, revealing a photograph laminated in plastic that had gone cloudy with age. 2 faces smiled up at him. Margaret, young and beautiful, standing beside him on the tarmac at Edwards. The day after his most famous flight. The day before the rest of their lives. He traced her face with his thumb. The same gesture he had made 10,000 times in shelters and doorways and under bridges when the nights grew cold and the memories grew sharp. Sir, Captain Vance had approached again, his voice carrying the performative concern of a man playing to cameras. Sir, I'm going to need you to put that away and come with security. Walter closed the wallet slowly, returned it to his pocket. When he looked up, his eyes had changed. The distant haze had cleared, replaced by something harder, something that had been forged in cockpits and hospitals in 7 years of solitary grief. You asked what I flew, Captain. His voice was stronger now, carrying across the tarmac with an authority that made several onlookers straighten unconsciously. You asked me to prove it. I was being sarcastic. Vance's smile had become fixed, uncertain. Obviously, you did not actually fly anything. November 21st, 2000. Walter's voice took on the clipped precision of a mission debrief. Flight number 234 of the X-35 Joint Strike Fighter Demonstration Program. I departed Edwards Air Force Base at 0847 hours for a scheduled performance envelope test. Primary objective was demonstrating short takeoff and vertical landing capability for the Department of Defense Evaluation Committee. Vance's smile flickered. Anyone could look that up online. At approximately 0912 hours, Walter continued as if he had not heard, at an altitude of 15,423 feet and an airspeed of 387 knots. The primary flight control computer experienced a cascading software failure. The aircraft entered an uncontrolled descent. Rate of descent was approximately 12,000 feet per minute. The tarmac had gone quiet. The crew chief who had been watching earlier had set down his wrench entirely. Lieutenant Colonel Chun had pushed to the front of the crowd, her face pale. Standard recovery procedures were ineffective. Walter's hands had begun moving at his sides, unconsciously recreating the control inputs from a cockpit 20 years gone. The backup systems were corrupted by the same software fault. At 8,000 feet, I made the decision to attempt a manual override of the flight control system. His eyes found Vance's, and in them was the cold certainty of a man who had stared death in the face and refused to blink. I executed an inverted recovery maneuver at 4,000 feet above the Mojave Desert, manually inputting control surface commands while bypassing the corrupted flight computer. The technique had never been attempted before. It has never been attempted since. And the aircraft that you are standing next to, Captain, exists because I did not die that day. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the distant roar of jet engines seemed to fade. And somewhere in the crowd, a woman's voice whispered a single word that would change everything. Spectre. The word hung in the air like smoke from a flare. Spectre. Lieutenant Colonel Miranda Chun had not meant to say it aloud. It had escaped from somewhere deep in her memory, pulled out by the precise recitation of flight data that she had studied 100 times in simulator recreations and classified briefings. Captain Vance turned sharply toward the sound. "What did you say?" Chun did not answer. She was staring at the old man with an expression that hovered somewhere between disbelief and reverence. Her feet carried her forward without conscious decision, pushing past the security barrier, crossing the empty space between the crowd and the detained vagrant who had just recited classified flight parameters from memory. Vance stepped in her path. "Colonel, this area is restricted. I have the situation under control." Chun looked at him as though seeing him for the first time. Her voice was quiet but carried the unmistakable weight of rank. "Captain, step aside. Colonel, with respect, this man is a trespasser. He is clearly mentally unstable and has been making outlandish claims about flying military aircraft. I am handling the security breach according to protocol." Chen's eyes moved past Vance to the old man, standing between the two security airmen. His posture had changed in the last few minutes. The stooped shuffle of a homeless veteran had given way to something straighter, something that looked almost like attention. The data he just recited. Chen's voice was careful, measured. The altitude, the airspeed, the rate of descent. "Where did you hear those numbers, Captain?" Vance shrugged impatiently. "The internet. A documentary. These conspiracy theorists memorize all kinds of nonsense to make themselves sound credible. That flight data has never been declassified." Chun turned to face him fully, and there was something in her expression that made Vance take an involuntary step backward. "I have studied that incident under special access protocols. I have recreated it in simulators at Nellis. The numbers he quoted are accurate to the decimal point. They are not available to the public. They are not in any documentary. And the only way he could know them is if he was there." The crowd had pressed closer to the security barrier. Phones were raised. Cameras were recording. Master Sergeant Frank Delaney, the senior maintainer who had been working on a nearby aircraft, had positioned himself with a clear line of sight and was filming everything. Vance's face had reddened, but his voice maintained its confident edge. Then he got them from somewhere else. Maybe he worked ground crew. Maybe he overheard something. That does not make him a test pilot. Chun ignored him. She walked past the captain and stopped directly in front of Walter, studying his face with an intensity that made the security airmen exchange uncertain glances. The inverted recovery at 4,000 feet. Chun spoke softly, as though they were alone on the tarmac. "You bypass the flight control computer manually. Input the control surface commands directly through the maintenance access port." No one had ever done that in flight before. Walter met her gaze. His eyes were clear now, focused, present in a way they had not been since security first grabbed his arms. It was the only option. His voice matched hers in volume, a private conversation conducted in public view. The software fault had corrupted both primary and backup systems. If I had ejected, the aircraft would have been destroyed. The program would have been set back by years. Boeing would have won the contract. Chun nodded slowly. "And your solution?" "The manual override sequence. It became the foundation of the emergency recovery protocols for every F-35 variant. They refined it, automated most of it." Walter's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "Made it easier, but the bones are the same." Vance pushed forward, his voice rising. "This is ridiculous. Colonel, you cannot seriously be entertaining this fantasy. Look at him. He is homeless. He is delusional. You probably heard some pilot talking in a bar and built a whole identity around it. Chun turned slowly. The look she gave Vance contained something that made his next words die in his throat. Captain, I'm going to ask you a question. She spoke with the deliberate calm of someone restraining considerable anger. Do you know what call sign is? How it is earned? Vance straightened defensively. Of course I do. Then you know that a pilot does not choose their own call sign. It is given to them, usually based on something they did. Something memorable. She paused. Do you know what Spectre means? Vance said nothing. It means ghost. Chin turned back to Walter. It was given to a test pilot at Edwards in the 1990s. A pilot who could fly so precisely that radar had difficulty tracking him. A pilot who disappeared and reappeared on screens like he was not entirely real. The name became legend in the test pilot community. They talked about Spectre like he was a myth. She reached out slowly and touched the faded patch on Walter's flight jacket. The threads were worn almost smooth, but the shape was still visible. The Joint Strike Fighter Program insignia. This patch is not available for purchase. Chin's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. It was issued only to program personnel, and even among them, only a handful ever flew the prototype. She looked up at Walter's weathered face, searching for confirmation of what she already knew. 340 test flights. Her voice cracked slightly, more than any other pilot. The save at 4,000 feet. The helmet display innovations. The cockpit ergonomics that every F-35 pilot uses today. Walter said nothing. He did not need to. Chin took a step back. When she spoke again, her voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. Captain Vance, you asked this man to prove he flew the prototype. She drew herself to full attention, her shoulders squared, her chin raised. I'm a combat veteran. I have flown F-35s in 3 theaters of operation. Every time I strap into that cockpit, I am flying an aircraft that exists because of what this man did. She turned to face the crowd, the cameras, the witnesses who would carry this moment into the world. And I am telling you, as someone who has dedicated her career to studying his legacy, that you're looking at one of the most important test pilots in the history of American aviation. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant thunder of jets. And then Chun did something that Captain Bradley Vance would remember for the rest of his career. She raised her hand to her brow and delivered a perfect salute to the homeless man in the tattered flight jacket. The salute held for 3 seconds that felt like an eternity. Walter Jameson stood motionless, his arms still loosely held by security airmen who no longer seemed certain of their purpose. Something shifted in his chest, a pressure he had carried for 7 years, a weight he had grown so accustomed to that he had forgotten it was there. He did not return the salute. He had lost that right when he abandoned everything, when he walked away from his daughter and his home and his identity. A man who had spent 7 years hiding under bridges did not deserve military courtesies. But Chun held her position, arm rigid, eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that refused to let him look away. Captain Vance recovered first. His voice cut through the moment with desperate authority. Colonel Chun, stand down. You are making a spectacle of yourself based on the ramblings of a mentally disturbed vagrant. Chun lowered her salute slowly. She did not turn to face Vance. Her eyes remained on Walter as she spoke. Captain, I need you to understand something. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it more devastating. I wrote my thesis at the Academy on the X-35 demonstration program. I have spent 15 years studying every aspect of the Joint Strike Fighter competition. I have interviewed program directors, engineers, and surviving test pilots. I have access to classified archives that you do not know exist. She finally turned to face him, and I am telling you, with absolute certainty, that you have just publicly humiliated one of the most decorated test pilots in Air Force history. Vance's jaw tightened. He glanced at the crowd, at the cameras, at the situation spiraling beyond his control. Even if that were true, which it does not change the fact that he trespassed on a military installation. He broke the law. My job is base security, and I'm doing my job. Walter spoke then, his voice cutting through the argument with quiet precision. He is right. Chin turned back sharply. Sir, I did trespass. Walter's eyes moved across the tarmac, taking in the aircraft, the crowd, the summer sky stretching endless above them. I crawled through a drainage culvert to get onto this base. I violated federal security protocols. Whatever I did 20 years ago does not change what I did today. Chen opened her mouth to protest, but Walter continued. I did not come here for recognition. I did not come here to cause trouble. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. I came here to see her one more time. The aircraft, and maybe, if I was lucky, to catch a glimpse of my daughter. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Ripples of murmured confusion spread through the crowd. Your daughter? Chen's brow furrowed. Walter reached into his jacket pocket again, slower this time, making sure everyone could see his movements. He withdrew the worn leather wallet and opened it to a different photograph. This one was newer than the picture of Margaret, though still creased and faded from years of handling. Two young women in graduation robes, arms around each other, laughing at something off camera. One of them had Margaret's eyes. Margaret's smile. Margaret's way of tilting her head when she was happy. Rebecca. Walter's thumb traced the edge of the photograph. Dr. Rebecca Jameson Park now. She worked for Lockheed Martin on the F-35 program. His voice caught. She's here today, somewhere in the VIP section. I saw her name on the list. The crowd had gone absolutely silent. Even Vance seemed frozen, his prepared objections dying unspoken. I have not seen her in 7 years. Walter closed the wallet carefully, returning it to his pocket with the reverence of a man handling sacred relics. After her mother died, I could not look at her without seeing Margaret. Every time she smiled, every time she laughed, it was like losing my wife all over again. His hands trembled slightly at his sides. I thought I was protecting her by leaving. I thought my grief was a burden she should not have to carry. I thought if I disappeared, she could move on, build a life, be happy. He looked up at the sky, at the thin wisps of cloud drifting past, at the same blue expanse he had flown through 1,000 times. I was a coward. The word came out flat, an admission rather than a confession. The man who stayed calm at 400 knots in an uncontrolled descent did not have the courage to stay with his own daughter, to let her see him broken, to ask for help. Chen's expression had transformed from professional skepticism to something raw. Her eyes glistened in the afternoon light. I had been watching her from a distance. Walter continued. Library computers. Public records. I know she got her doctorate. I know she got married. I know she has dedicated her career to the aircraft that I helped create. A bitter smile crossed his weathered face. My daughter is working on my legacy, and she does not even know I am alive. The security airman had released his arms entirely now. They stood on either side of him like an honor guard rather than captors, their faces uncertain, their training offering no guidance for this situation. I did not come here to be recognized. Walter's voice was steady now, the trembling gone, replaced by the same calm that had carried him through emergencies at the edge of the atmosphere. I came here to hear the jets one more time, to smell the fuel, to feel that vibration in my chest that tells me I'm still alive. He turned to face Captain Vance directly. You can arrest me. You can fine me. You can do whatever the regulations require. I broke the law, and I will accept the consequences. His eyes held Vance's without flinching. But I'm asking you, Captain, before you take me away, let me stay for one more minute. Let me look at that aircraft. Let me remember who I used to be before I lost everything. Vance opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and before he could speak, a new voice cut across the tarmac from the direction of the VIP section. Someone get General Howard. The voice belonged to an aide in dress uniform, running toward them with barely contained urgency. Right now, tell her it is about Walter Jameson. The name echoed across the flight line like a call sign from the past. And somewhere in the VIP tent, a woman with her father's eyes looked up from a technical briefing as a chill ran down her spine. Brigadier General Patricia Howard had been reviewing the afternoon demonstration schedule when her aide burst into the VIP tent with the expression of someone who had seen a ghost. The words that followed made no sense. Walter Jameson, on the flight line, claiming to be Spectre. Walter Jameson is dead. Howard set down her tablet slowly. He disappeared 8 years ago. His family had him declared legally deceased. Ma'am, the aide's voice was breathless. You need to see this for yourself. Colonel Chun is out there. She saluted him. She says she is certain. Howard rose from her chair with the deliberate calm of someone who had commanded airmen in combat zones. She had been stationed at Edwards during Walter's final years with the program. She had never met him personally, but she knew the legends. Everyone at Edwards knew the legends. The walk from the VIP tent to the flight line took less than 2 minutes, but it felt longer. Howard passed rows of spectators craning their necks towards some commotion near the F-35 display. She passed contractors and officers and families with children, all of them focused on something she could not yet see. And then she saw him. The homeless man, standing between 2 security airmen, looked nothing like the photographs she remembered from the Edwards Hall of Fame. Those images showed a young pilot with sharp eyes and a confident smile, dressed in a flight suit that bore the patches of a dozen successful programs. The man on the tarmac was weathered beyond his years, stooped, wearing a jacket that had seen better decades. But there was something in the way he stood, something in the set of his shoulders despite everything. A posture that 40 years of military service had taught Howard to recognize. This man had worn a uniform. This man had stood at attention more times than he could count. The muscle memory was still there, buried beneath 7 years of survival. General Howard. Chun snapped to attention as the senior officer approached. Ma'am, I believe this man is Walter Jameson. Call sign Spectre. Lead test pilot on the X-35 program. I heard. Howard stopped a few feet from Walter, studying his face with a careful assessment of a career officer. She noted the faded patches on his jacket, the precision in his hands despite their trembling, the way his eyes tracked to her rank insignia with automatic recognition. Captain Vance stepped forward eagerly. General, this vagrant trespassed onto the installation through a security gap. He's been making outlandish claims and causing a disruption. I recommend we remove him immediately and conduct a full security review. Howard did not look at Vance. Her attention remained fixed on Walter, the drainage culvert. Her voice was conversational. 200 meters east of the main gate. You knew about that? Walter nodded slowly. It has been there since the base expansion in 1987. I reported it 3 times during my years at Edwards. They never fixed it. Howard's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes. That report would be buried in classified archives. Not the kind of thing someone could look up. Colonel Chun tells me you recited flight data from a classified incident. Howard continued. Data that has never been released to the public. Yes, ma'am. She tells me you described the manual override technique that saved the X-35 prototype. A technique that became the foundation of emergency recovery protocols for the entire F-35 program. Yes, ma'am. Howard was silent for a long moment. The crowd pressed against the security barriers, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Master Sergeant Delaney had not lowered his phone. The cameras kept recording. I was at Edwards during your time there. Howard finally said, I never met you personally. I was support staff then, but I remember the day of the famous flight. I remember the silence in the control room when we thought you were going to die. I remember the sound when you reported that you had regained control. She paused. I remember the cheering. Walter said nothing. His jaw was tight, his eyes glistening with something that might have been memory or might have been grief. Howard turned to her aide. Give me the archive personnel roster from the Joint Strike Fighter Test Program, specifically the pilot assignments from 1998 to 2002, and get Program Director Morrison on the phone. The aide nodded and stepped away, already tapping a tablet. General, Vance interjected, surely this is not necessary. We cannot simply take the word of a homeless trespasser based on some flight data he could have obtained anywhere. Howard turned to face Vance for the first time. Her expression was unreadable, but her voice carried an edge that made the captain take an involuntary step backward. Captain Vance, I have been in the Air Force for 34 years. I have commanded squadrons. I have sent pilots into combat. I have written letters to families whose loved ones did not come home. She stepped closer to him, and in all that time, I have learned one thing above all else. You do not dismiss a man who claims to have served until you have verified the truth. You do not mock a man who wears a flight jacket until you know what he did to earn it. And you absolutely do not humiliate a potential veteran on camera in front of hundreds of witnesses without being certain of your facts. Vance's face had gone pale. I was following security protocols. You were performing. Howard's voice was quiet but carried across the silent tarmac. You saw a homeless man, and you saw an opportunity to demonstrate your authority. You played to the crowd. You made assumptions based on appearance. She glanced at the cameras, still recording. And if this man turns out to be who Colonel Chun believes he is, Captain, you have just publicly humiliated a legend in front of the entire internet. Vance opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Howard turned back to Walter. The aide was returning with a tablet, the screen displaying a personnel photograph from 2 decades ago. The face in the image was younger, sharper, unmarked by years of grief and exposure. But the eyes were the same. The set of the jaw was the same. The quiet intensity that looked out from the screen matched exactly the man standing on the tarmac. Howard looked between the photograph and Walter's weathered face. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "My God, it really is you." The words hung in the summer air, settling over the crowd like the first drops of rain before a storm. General Howard stood frozen with the tablet in her hands, her eyes moving between the young pilot in the photograph and the weathered man standing before her. Walter Jameson, alive. The murmur that rippled through the spectators carried confusion and curiosity in equal measure. Most of them did not recognize the name. There were families here to see jets fly, enthusiasts hoping for photographs, children dreaming of cockpits. They did not know what they were witnessing, but the pilots knew. Word had begun spreading through the demonstration team area. Fragments of conversation passed between flight suits like electricity jumping between circuits. Spectre, on the flight line. They found Spectre. Lieutenant Colonel Chun had not moved from her position near Walter. Her salute had been lowered, but her posture remained rigid with barely contained emotion. She had spent 15 years studying this man's techniques, recreating his maneuvers in simulators, trying to understand how he had done what should have been impossible. And now he was standing 10 feet away, wearing a jacket held together by threads and memory. General Howard handed the tablet back to her aide and stepped closer to Walter. Her voice dropped to something private despite the hundreds of witnesses. "We thought you were dead." The words carried no accusation, only a kind of exhausted wonder. "Your family had you declared deceased 3 years ago. There was a memorial service at Edwards. They put your name on the wall." Walter's expression flickered. The wall. The same wall where Margaret's photograph still hung in his memory, smiling at him from the observation room. "I did not know." His voice was rough. "I did not mean for anyone to think that." "Where have you been?" Howard asked. 8 years, Walter. Where does a man like you disappear to for 8 years? Walter was silent for a long moment. His eyes drifted to the F-35 gleaming in the afternoon sun, and something in his face softened with a grief so profound it made Chun look away. "Everywhere." His answer was barely audible. "Nowhere. I stopped being Walter Jameson the day Margaret died. I became someone else. Something else." Howard waited. The crowd waited. Even Captain Vance, pale and sweating near the security detail, waited. "I could not stay." Walter continued. "Every room in our house had her voice in it. Every photograph was an accusation. And Rebecca." His voice cracked on the name. "Every time I looked at my daughter, I saw her mother. I saw everything I had lost, everything I could not protect." He raised his hands and looked at them. Weathered palms, mapped with calluses and scars. These hands flew experimental aircraft at the edge of what was possible. These hands saved a program worth billions of dollars. But they could not save Margaret. They could not hold her when she needed me most. They could not stop the cancer that ate her from the inside. He lowered his hands slowly. "I left because I was broken. And I stayed away because I convinced myself that my brokenness would infect everyone I loved." Chun spoke then, her voice thick with emotion, she was struggling to contain. "Sir, your daughter never stopped looking for you." Walter's head turned sharply. "What?" "Rebecca." Chin took a step forward. "I have met her. At industry conferences. At program reviews. She works on the F-35 avionics systems. She has your photograph on her desk. She checks missing persons databases every month. She has never stopped believing you were alive." The information hit Walter like turbulence at altitude. His body swayed slightly, and one of the security airmen instinctively reached out to steady him. "She should have moved on." Walter's voice was a whisper. "I wanted her to move on. That is not how it works." Howard said quietly, "That is not how love works. Especially not the love between a father and daughter." She turned to her aide again. "Dr. Rebecca Jameson Park. She is with the Lockheed Martin delegation in the VIP section. Find her. Bring her here." The aide nodded and disappeared into the crowd. Walter's face had gone pale beneath the weathering. "No." His voice carried sudden urgency. "Please. I cannot. Not like this." He gestured at his tattered clothing, his unwashed hair, the evidence of 7 years of self-imposed exile. "I cannot let her see me like this." Howard shook her head slowly. "Walter, she has been looking for you for 7 years. She does not care what you look like. You do not understand." Walter's composure was cracking now, the calm precision of his earlier recitation giving way to raw panic. "I abandoned her. I left her alone after her mother died. I disappeared without explanation. I made her believe I was dead." "Yes." Howard's voice was firm but not unkind. "You did all of those things, and she is still looking for you. What does that tell you?" Walter had no answer. His hands were trembling again, and this time it was not from memory. Chun stepped closer, her voice gentle in a way that combat pilots rarely allowed themselves to be. "Sir, I have seen your daughter speak about you. At a conference 2 years ago, someone asked about the pilot who saved the X-35. She talked about you for 20 minutes. She knows every mission you flew, every innovation you developed. She became an aerospace engineer because of you." She paused, letting the words land. "She did not become an engineer to move on from you, sir. She became an engineer to stay close to you, to work on your legacy, to keep some part of you alive." Walter's eyes had filled with tears. He made no move to wipe them away. They traced lines down his weathered cheeks, cutting through years of grime and grief. "I do not deserve her forgiveness." The words came out broken. "Maybe not," Howard said, "but she's going to give it to you anyway, because that is what family does." The crowd had gone completely silent. Even the children had stopped fidgeting. Something sacred was happening on that tarmac, and everyone present seemed to sense it. And then, from the direction of the VIP section, a woman's voice cut through the stillness. "Dad?" The word carried across the flight line like a beacon. Walter turned slowly, his heart stopping in his chest. And there she was, Rebecca, his daughter, pushing through the crowd with tears streaming down her face, her professional composure shattered, her eyes fixed on the father she had been searching for since the day he disappeared. She looked exactly like Margaret. Rebecca Jameson Park had been reviewing avionics data in the VIP tent when the aide found her. The words made no sense at first. "Your father, on the flight line. You need to come now." Her father was dead. She had accepted that 3 years ago when the court finally granted the petition. She had stood in a conference room with lawyers and signed papers that turned Walter Jameson from a missing person into a memory. She had wept for a week afterward, grieving not just his death, but the absence of a body, a burial, any kind of closure. And now an aide in dress uniform was telling her that he was standing on the tarmac. She did not remember leaving the tent. She did not remember pushing through the crowd. She only remembered the moment she saw him. He was thinner than she remembered, older. His flight jacket hung loose on a frame that had been whittled down by years of insufficient food and inadequate shelter. His hair had gone gray, wild, unkempt. His face was a map of hard weather and harder choices. But his eyes were the same eyes that had watched her take her first steps, the same eyes that had beamed with pride at her high school graduation, the same eyes that had gone hollow and distant in the months after her mother's funeral. "Dad?" The word escaped before she could stop it, before she could think about protocol or propriety or the hundreds of people watching. Before she could remember that she was supposed to be angry, that she was supposed to demand explanations. That 7 years of abandonment should have built walls that a single word could not breach. But the walls did not exist. They had never existed. Every night for 7 years, she had prayed for exactly this moment. And now that it was here, all the anger and hurt and confusion dissolved like morning fog burned away by sunrise. She was running before she knew she had started moving. Her heels caught on the tarmac, and she kicked them off without breaking stride. Her carefully pinned hair came loose and streamed behind her. Her professional demeanor shattered into something raw and primal and absolutely human. "Dad!" Walter stood frozen as his daughter crossed the distance between them. His mind screamed at him to move, to meet her halfway, to do something other than stand paralyzed by the weight of his own guilt. But his body would not respond. 7 years of convincing himself that he did not deserve this moment had locked him in place. And then she was there, her arms wrapped around him with a force that drove the breath from his lungs. Her face pressed against his chest, against the tattered flight jacket that smelled of shelters and streets and survival. Her tears soaked through the worn fabric and touched his skin like absolution. "I found you." Her voice was muffled against his chest, broken by sobs. "I found you. I found you. I found you." The words repeated like a mantra, like a prayer answered, like the only thing that mattered in the entire world. Walter's paralysis broke. His arms rose slowly, trembling, uncertain. They wrapped around his daughter with the desperate grip of a drowning man finding solid ground. He pulled her closer and felt something crack inside his chest. Not breaking, healing. A wound 7 years old finally allowed to close. "I'm sorry." The words came out in fragments, torn from somewhere deeper than language. "Rebecca, baby, I'm so sorry. I should not have left. I should not have stayed away. I should have been there." Rebecca pulled back just far enough to look at his face. Her eyes, Margaret's eyes, searched his weathered features with an intensity that stripped away every defense he had ever built. "You left a note." Her voice was steadier now, though tears still carved channels down her cheeks. 3 sentences. "I love you. I am sorry. Do not look for me." Walter nodded, unable to speak. "I never stopped looking." Rebecca's hands came up to cup his face, her thumbs wiping at tears he had not realized he was shedding. Every database, every shelter, every John Doe, and every morgue in 3 states. I hired private investigators. I put up flyers. I never stopped. Why? The question came out broken. "I abandoned you. I left you alone after your mother died. Why would you keep looking for someone who did that?" Rebecca's expression shifted. Something fierce entered her eyes, something that reminded Walter so strongly of Margaret that his breath caught. "Because you're my father." The words were simple, absolute, unassailable. "Because I lost Mom, and I was not going to lose you too. Because I know why you left, even if you never explained it. Because grief makes people do terrible things to themselves, and I knew that whatever you were doing out there, wherever you were punishing yourself for something that was never your fault." Walter shook his head. "I could not save her. I could not protect her. What good was I? You were everything." Rebecca's voice cracked. "You were everything to her, and you were everything to me. Mom would not want this. She would not want you living on the streets. She would not want you hiding from the people who love you." She pulled him close again, her arms tight around his thin frame. "I do not want an apology, Dad. I do not want an explanation. I do not want you to justify anything or defend anything or explain anything. I just want you back. I have wanted you back every single day for 7 years." Walter held his daughter and felt the last of his resistance crumble. The walls he had built, the excuses he had crafted, the elaborate architecture of self-punishment that had kept him on the streets long after he could have come home. All of it fell away in the face of his daughter's stubborn, relentless, impossible love. The crowd around them had gone silent. General Howard stood with her hand over her heart. Lieutenant Colonel Chun was openly weeping. Even the security airmen had tears on their cheeks. And somewhere at the edge of the crowd, Captain Bradley Vance watched the scene unfold with the dawning realization that his career had just ended. He had mocked this man. He had called him a vagrant. He had demanded he prove his service, never imagining for a moment that proof would arrive in the form of F-35 pilots at attention and a daughter's desperate embrace. The cameras were still recording. The phones were still raised. And Captain Vance understood, with cold certainty, that the footage of this moment would follow him for the rest of his life. Walter pulled back from his daughter just enough to look at her face. He reached up with one trembling hand and brushed a strand of hair from her eyes. The same gesture he had made when she was a child. The same gesture Margaret had always loved. "I missed you." His voice was barely a whisper. "Every day, every single day, I watched from a distance. I saw you graduate. I saw your name on the contractor list today. I came here hoping just to see you one more time." Rebecca's eyes widened. "You were there? At my graduation? Behind a tree?" Walter admitted. "At the edge of the lawn. I walked 12 miles to be there. I just wanted to see you smile." Rebecca let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob. "You stubborn, stupid, wonderful man." She pulled him close again. "You could have just come home." "I know." Walter whispered against her hair. "I know." General Howard allowed them a full minute of uninterrupted embrace before she stepped forward. Her voice was gentle, but carried the unmistakable tone of someone who needed to restore order to a situation that had spiraled far beyond normal parameters. "Mr. Jameson." She waited until Walter's eyes met hers. "I need to make a phone call. There is someone who will want to verify your identity personally, and I suspect he will want to speak with you." Walter nodded slowly, his arms still wrapped around Rebecca's shoulders, as though afraid she might disappear if he let go. Howard turned to her aide. "Get me retired General Morrison, program director for the Joint Strike Fighter during the X-35 development phase. He should be at his home in California." The aide stepped away, already dialing. The crowd had swelled even further. Word had spread through the airshow like wildfire. The demonstration team had gathered near the security barrier, a row of flight suits watching with expressions that ranged from disbelief to reverence. Ground crews had abandoned their posts. Even the food vendors had stopped serving. Captain Vance stood at the edge of the scene, forgotten and irrelevant. His face had taken on a grayish pallor. The cameras were still recording, and he knew with sickening certainty that every moment of his earlier mockery had been captured. The internet would not be kind. The Air Force would be less kind still. General Howard's aide returned with a phone extended. "Sir, I have General Morrison on the line." Howard took the phone and activated the speaker function. The tinny voice that emerged was aged but sharp, carrying the authority of a man who had spent decades commanding some of the most advanced programs in military aviation history. "Patricia." Morrison's voice crackled through the speaker. "My aide tells me you have a situation. Something about a homeless man claiming to be Walter Jameson." "Yes, sir." Howard kept her voice professional despite the extraordinary circumstances. "We have a male individual on site who has provided detailed knowledge of classified flight test data from the X-35 program. Lieutenant Colonel Chun, one of our demonstration pilots, has positively identified markings consistent with program personnel. We have also matched his appearance to archive personnel photographs." There was a long pause on the line. "Walter Jameson has been dead for 3 years." Morrison's voice was careful. "His family had him declared deceased. I attended the memorial service myself." "Yes, sir." Howard glanced at Walter, who stood motionless with Rebecca pressed against his side. "But the individual in question has provided information that should be impossible for anyone outside the program to know. I am requesting your assistance in final verification." Another pause. Then Morrison spoke again, his voice carrying a different weight. "Put him on." Howard extended the phone toward Walter. He looked at it for a moment, as though it were a foreign object, something from a life he had left behind. Then he gently released Rebecca and stepped forward, taking the phone in hands that trembled slightly. "General Morrison." Walter's voice had changed. The roughness remained, but beneath it was the crisp precision of a pilot addressing a superior officer. "It has been a long time, sir." Silence stretched across the connection. When Morrison spoke again, his voice had cracked. "Walter, Jesus Christ." "Walter, We thought you were dead. I know, sir. I apologize for any distress I may have caused. Distress. Morrison let out a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. You disappeared off the face of the earth. Your daughter spent years looking for you. We put your name on the wall at Edwards, and you apologized for distress. Walter said nothing. There was nothing to say. Morrison's voice steadied. I need to verify. The inverted recovery at 4,000 feet. What did I say to you when you landed? Walter closed his eyes. The memory rose unbidden, sharp and clear despite the years. You were waiting on the tarmac. You grabbed my hand before I was fully out of the cockpit. You said that what I did was the most skilled piece of flying you had ever witnessed in 40 years of aviation. Then you pressed something into my palm. The pin. Morrison's voice was barely audible. Walter reached into his pocket and withdrew the small metal object. The JSF program director's personal recognition coin, worn smooth by years of handling. You told me it was the only one ever made. Walter continued. You had it crafted the night before because you knew the demonstration flight would either make or break the program. You said you had it made for whoever saved us. And then you told me to keep it, that I had earned it. The silence on the line stretched for 10 seconds. 20. 30. When Morrison spoke again, his voice had broken completely. God, it really is you. Walter, where have you been? What happened to you? Walter looked at the crowd around him. The pilots in their flight suits. The general with her hand over her heart. His daughter, watching him with tears still streaming down her face. The aircraft gleaming in the afternoon sun, carrying 340 test flights worth of his life in every circuit and strut. I got lost, sir. His voice was quiet but carried across the silent tarmac. I lost my wife. I lost myself. And I convinced myself that I did not deserve to be found. Morrison was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had sent pilots into danger and brought them home again, who understood what it meant to lose people and carry that loss forward. Listen to me, Walter. Listen carefully. What you did for this program, what you did for this country, is not erased by grief. It is not erased by weakness. It is not erased by 7 years of running. You saved the Joint Strike Fighter. You saved the careers of everyone who worked on it. You saved the lives of every pilot who has flown an F-35 into combat and come home because of the systems you helped develop. Walter's jaw tightened. You do not get to decide that you are worthless. Morrison continued. You do not get to throw away a legacy like yours because you could not save one person you loved. None of us can save everyone. Walter, not even the best of us. All we can do is keep flying. The words hit Walter like turbulence. His grip on the phone tightened. General Howard. Morrison's voice regained its command authority. I am officially confirming the identity of the individual on your flight line. Walter Ray Jameson, call sign Spectre. Lead test pilot for the X-35 Joint Strike Fighter Demonstration Program. 340 test flights. Holder of the program director's personal recognition pin. One of the most important pilots in the history of American military aviation. His voice softened. Take care of him, Patricia. We owe him more than we can ever repay. The line went silent. Howard took the phone back and looked at Walter with an expression that mingled respect and sorrow in equal measure. Well, Mr. Jameson, she said quietly, it seems you have been officially resurrected. Walter said nothing. He simply turned and looked at the F-35, at the aircraft that existed because of him, at the legacy he had tried so hard to run away from. And for the first time in 7 years, he did not feel the urge to disappear. The confirmation from General Morrison rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Murmurs became exclamations. Confusion became understanding. And among the demonstration pilots gathered at the security barrier, something shifted. Lieutenant Colonel Chun was the first to move. She had lowered her salute earlier, but now she raised it again with rigid precision. Her eyes were fixed on Walter with an intensity that bordered on reverence. A second pilot followed, then a third, then a fourth. Within 30 seconds, every member of the F-35 demonstration team stood at attention, arms raised in salute to the homeless man in the tattered flight jacket. 5 of the most elite aviators in the United States Air Force, honoring a legend they had studied but never expected to meet. Master Sergeant Delaney had not stopped recording. His phone captured every moment. The salutes, the tears streaming down hardened faces, the absolute silence that had fallen over the crowd. General Howard watched the scene unfold with an expression that mixed pride and profound emotion. She had commanded airmen for 3 decades. She had seen courage and sacrifice in countless forms. But she had never seen anything quite like this. Walter stood motionless, his daughter still pressed against his side. The salutes hit him harder than any turbulence he had ever encountered. These were combat pilots, warriors who had flown missions over hostile territory, who had faced enemy fire and brought their aircraft home. They were saluting him. He did not deserve it. 7 years of self-imposed exile had convinced him of that. 7 years of shelters and soup kitchens and sleeping under bridges had stripped away any sense of worth he once possessed. But the pilots held their salutes. They did not waver. Colonel Chin spoke without lowering her arm. "Sir, requesting permission to address the assembled personnel." Howard nodded. "Granted." Chin's voice carried across the tarmac, pitched to reach every spectator and every camera. "The man standing before you is Walter Ray Jameson, call sign Spectre. Between 1998 and 2002, he flew 340 test flights on the X-35 prototype. That is more than any other pilot in the program's history." She paused, letting the numbers sink in. On November 21st, 2000, during a critical demonstration flight that would determine whether the X-35 or its competitor would become America's next-generation fighter, the aircraft experienced a catastrophic flight control failure. At 15,000 feet and nearly 400 knots, the primary and backup computers both failed. The crowd was absolutely still. Even the children had stopped moving, sensing the gravity of the moment. Standard recovery procedures were useless. Chun continued. Ejection would have destroyed the aircraft and likely killed the program. "We will be flying something else today, or nothing at all." She lowered her salute slowly, but her eyes never left Walter's face. Instead of ejecting, this man executed a maneuver that had never been attempted before. He manually bypassed the flight control computer, inverting the aircraft to maintain lift while inputting control surface commands directly through the maintenance access port. He regained controlled flight at 4,000 feet above the Mojave Desert. She stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and Walter. The technique he invented in those seconds became the foundation of the emergency recovery protocols programmed into every F-35 ever built. The cockpit ergonomics he refined are what I touch every time I strap in. The helmet display system he helped develop is what I see every time I fly. Her voice cracked slightly. Every F-35 pilot in the world owes their capability to this man. Every successful mission, every safe landing, every pilot who came home to their family instead of being carried home in a box. We fly his legacy every single day. She came to attention again and snapped a fresh salute. "Sir, on behalf of the F-35 demonstration team and every pilot who has ever flown the Lightning II, thank you for your service." The other pilots held their salutes. The silence stretched. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, someone began to clap. It started slowly. A single pair of hands. Then another. Then a dozen. Then 100. The applause built like a wave, crashing over the tarmac, washing over Walter with a force that made him sway on his feet. Rebecca's arm tightened around him, steadying him. Her face was wet with tears, but she was smiling. A fierce, proud smile that reminded him so powerfully of Margaret that his heart ached. The pilots lowered their salutes as the applause continued. She stepped back in a line with her fellow aviators, but her eyes remained on Walter. General Howard moved to stand beside him. She did not speak immediately, allowing the moment to breathe, allowing the crowd to express what words could not capture. When the applause finally began to fade, she leaned close to Walter and spoke quietly. "Mr. Jameson, I believe there is still the matter of the trespassing charge." Walter nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am. I broke the law. I am prepared to accept the consequences." Howard's expression did not change, but something glinted in her eyes. "I have reviewed the circumstances," she said, her voice pitched to Carrie. An elderly veteran, experiencing what appears to be significant psychological distress related to service-connected trauma, entered the installation through an unsecured access point to view aircraft associated with his former service. She paused. "In my judgment, this matter does not warrant criminal prosecution. I am recommending that the trespassing charge be dropped and that Mr. Jameson be offered immediate access to veteran support services." A fresh wave of applause rippled through the crowd. However, Howard's voice hardened slightly, and she turned to look at Captain Vance, who stood frozen at the edge of the scene. "There is another matter that requires attention." Vance's face went white. "Captain Vance, your conduct today has been documented by approximately 300 personal recording devices and at least 4 professional media crews." Howard's voice was cold. "You publicly mocked and humiliated a distressed veteran based entirely on his appearance. You dismissed evidence of his service. You escalated a situation that should have been handled with basic human dignity." She stepped toward him. "I will be forwarding a complete report to your commanding officer with my recommendation for formal disciplinary proceedings. Your assignment to this base is terminated effective immediately. You will report to personnel for reassignment within the hour." Vance opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. The cameras were still recording. The crowd was still watching, and every face he could see held the same expression of contempt. "Yes, ma'am." The words came out barely above a whisper. Howard turned her back on him and returned to Walter's side. "Now, Mr. Jameson." Her voice softened. "I believe your daughter mentioned something about taking you home." Rebecca's arm tightened around Walter's waist. "Home." She said the word like a promise. "You're coming home, Dad, and you're never disappearing again." Walter looked at his daughter, at the pilot still standing at attention, at the aircraft that carried his life's work in every wire and rivet. And for the first time in 7 years, the word home did not fill him with fear. It filled him with hope. The demonstration team had lowered their salutes, but none of them had moved from their positions. They stood in a loose semicircle around Walter and Rebecca, a protective formation that had formed without conscious thought. These were pilots who had trained together, flown together, trusted each other with their lives. And now they had silently agreed to extend that trust to the man who had made their aircraft possible. Lieutenant Colonel Chun approached slowly, her eyes asking permission before she spoke. "Sir, if you are willing, the team would like to show you something." Walter looked at his daughter. Rebecca nodded, her hand finding his and squeezing gently. Chun led them across the tarmac toward the F-35 that had been the centerpiece of the static display. The crowd parted as they walked, faces turning to watch, phones still recording. Walter moved through them like a man in a dream, his worn boots scuffing against concrete that felt both foreign and familiar. The aircraft loomed larger as they approached. 45 feet of angular stealth geometry, matte gray coating designed to scatter radar, every surface optimized for a mission profile that Walter had helped define 2 decades ago. He stopped at the edge of the safety perimeter and simply looked. The weapons bay doors had been modified since his time. The sensor array was more advanced. The engine intake geometry had been refined, but the bones were the same. The fundamental architecture that he had helped test and validate was still there beneath all the improvements and iterations. "She is beautiful." Walter's voice was barely above a whisper. Chin smiled. "She handles even better than she looks. The flight characteristics you helped establish, the control responsiveness, the way she communicates with the pilot, it is still there. We feel it every time we fly." Walter's hand rose unconsciously, reaching toward the aircraft without quite touching it. His fingers stopped inches from the fuselage, trembling slightly. "May I?" Chin glanced at General Howard, who had followed them across the tarmac. Howard nodded. "Of course, sir." Walter's palm pressed flat against the aircraft skin. The metal was warm from the afternoon sun, smooth beneath his weathered hand. He closed his eyes and stood motionless, feeling the subtle vibration of systems running on standby, the hum of electronics waiting to spring to life. Behind his eyelids, he was not standing on a public tarmac surrounded by strangers. He was at Edwards, 20 years younger, running his hand along the X-35 prototype before climbing into the cockpit for another test flight. Margaret was watching from the observation room. The future was still unwritten. 340 flights. He said softly, "I remember every single one." The way she responded to input. The quirks in the control surfaces that the engineers said were impossible, but I could feel through the stick. The sound she made when everything was working perfectly. He opened his eyes. I thought I would never touch her again. Chen moved to stand beside him. "Sir, there's something else." She gestured to one of the ground crew, who approached carrying a tablet. On the screen was a photograph. A wall covered with framed pictures and nameplates. The Hall of Honor at Edwards Air Force Base. Your photograph was added after the memorial service. Chen explained, but there has always been some debate about whether it should remain, given that your remains were never recovered. Some people argued it was premature. Walter stared at the screen. His own face looked back at him, young and confident, wearing a flight suit and a smile he barely recognized. The test pilot community has been divided about it for years. Chen continued. Some want to keep it up as a memorial. Others thought it was inappropriate without confirmation of death. She took the tablet from the crew member and handed it to Walter. I think we can finally settle that debate, sir. Your photograph belongs on that wall. Not as a memorial, as a recognition of service from a living legend. Walter's throat tightened. He could not speak. Rebecca moved closer, wrapping her arm around his waist. She looked at the photograph on the screen and then at her father's weathered face. Mom will be so proud of you, she said quietly. She always was, even when you could not see it yourself. The mention of Margaret broke something loose in Walter's chest. A sob escaped before he could stop it. Then another. His shoulders shook with the force of grief and relief, and 7 years of suppressed emotion finally finding release. Rebecca held him. Chen stepped back to give him space. The pilots watched in respectful silence. When Walter finally composed himself, he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and looked at the aircraft again. I spent 7 years convinced that none of this mattered. He said hoarsely that what I did was worthless because I could not save the one person who mattered most. I told myself that the program would have succeeded without me, that any pilot could have done what I did. He shook his head slowly. I was wrong. I think I always knew I was wrong. But admitting it meant admitting that I had thrown away something valuable, that I had wasted years that I could have spent with my daughter, that I had chosen grief over life. He turned to face Rebecca. I am sorry. The words came out raw and honest. Not for leaving. I have already apologized for that. I am sorry for staying away. I am sorry for every birthday I missed. Every holiday I watched from a distance. Every moment I could have been your father and chose to be a ghost instead. Rebecca's eyes filled with fresh tears. Dad, you do not have to keep apologizing. Yes, I do. Walter's voice was firm. Because you deserve to hear it. Not once. As many times as it takes for you to believe that I know what I did. That I understand what I cost us both. He reached out and cupped her face in his weathered hands. I cannot give you back 7 years. But I can give you whatever years I have left. If you will have me. Rebecca let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob. She grabbed his hands and held them against her cheeks. You stubborn, impossible man. Of course I will have you. I have been waiting 7 years for you to come home. She pulled him into another embrace, holding him with the fierce determination of someone who had finally found what they had been searching for. General Howard watched from a respectful distance. The crowd had gone quiet again, sensing that something sacred was happening. Even the most hardened observers had tears on their cheeks. Chun stood beside the F-35, her hand resting lightly on the aircraft's fuselage. She looked at the man embracing his daughter and thought about legacy. Not the legacy of flight records and technical achievements, but the legacy of a father and daughter reunited after 7 years of separation. Some legacies were measured in test flights and engineering innovations. Others were measured in moments like this. Both mattered. Both would be remembered. The afternoon sun had begun its descent toward the horizon when General Howard finally approached Walter and Rebecca. The crowd had thinned slightly as the scheduled demonstrations resumed. But a significant number of spectators remained, unwilling to leave while the real story was still unfolding. Mr. Jameson. Howard's voice was gentle, but carried the undertone of someone who needed to address practical matters. We need to discuss next steps. You have been living without documentation, without medical care, without any of the support systems you earned through your service. Walter straightened slightly. His arm remained around Rebecca's shoulders, but his posture had shifted over the past hour. The stooped shuffle of a homeless veteran had given way to something that more closely resembled the man in the archive photographs. I understand, General. I am prepared to cooperate with whatever processes are necessary. Howard nodded. I have already contacted the VA regional director. Given the circumstances, they are expediting your case. We can have you enrolled in services within a week. Medical evaluation, psychological support, housing assistance if needed. He will not need housing assistance. Rebecca's voice was firm. He is coming home with me. Howard smiled slightly. I assumed as much, but the offer stands. The VA failed you once, Mr. Jameson. They lost your paperwork. They made you wait. They contributed to the circumstances that led to your disappearance. We intend to do better this time. Walter was quiet for a moment. The mention of the VA brought back memories he had tried to bury. The endless forms, the appointments that went nowhere, the feeling of being processed rather than helped. I appreciate that, General, he said finally, but I need to be honest. I stopped trusting institutions a long time ago. I stopped believing that the system could help people like me. Howard met his eyes steadily. That is a fair assessment, and I will not pretend that the system is perfect, but there are good people working within it. People who joined specifically because they wanted to help veterans. People who have been waiting for a chance to do right by someone who fell through the cracks. She paused. You spent 20 years serving your country, Mr. Jameson. You have earned a right to be served in return. Let us try. Rebecca squeezed her father's hand. Dad, please. Let them help. Walter looked at his daughter, at the hope in her eyes, at the fierce determination that had driven her to search for him for 7 years without giving up. He thought about Margaret, about what she would say if she could see him now. She had always been the one who pushed him to accept help, who reminded him that strength was not the same as stubbornness, who loved him even when he made it difficult. All right. The words came out slowly, as though each syllable cost him something. I will try. Howard's expression softened with relief. Thank you, Mr. Jameson. That is all we ask. She turned to her aide, who had been hovering nearby with a tablet. Lieutenant, please coordinate with the VA representative and ensure Mr. Jameson has everything he needs before he leaves the base. Yes, ma'am. As the aide moved away, Lieutenant Colonel Chen approached. She had changed out of her flight gear and now wore a service uniform, her hair pulled back, her expression thoughtful. Sir, I wanted to ask you something. She hesitated, as though unsure whether the question was appropriate. The inverted recovery. The manual override at 4,000 feet. I have recreated it in simulators dozens of times. I have studied your technique until I could execute it in my sleep. Walter turned to face her fully. But there is one thing I have never understood. Chen continued. How did you stay calm? How did you think clearly enough to invent a solution while the aircraft was screaming toward the desert floor? Walter was silent for a long moment. The question cut to the heart of something he had never fully explained. Not to the debriefers, not to the program directors, not even to Margaret. I did not stay calm. He said finally. I was terrified. Every alarm in the cockpit was screaming. Every instinct I had was telling me to eject, to save myself, to let the aircraft go. Chen waited, but then I thought about the program. Walter continued, about the thousands of people who had worked on that prototype, the engineers, the ground crews, the administrators who had fought for funding, the pilots who would fly whatever came next. His eyes moved to the F-35 standing on the tarmac, and I thought about Margaret, standing at the observation window, waiting for me to come home. If I ejected, I would survive, but I would have to tell her that I gave up, that I quit, that I let something we had all built together crash into the desert because saving it was too hard. He shook his head slowly. I was not calm, Colonel. I was more frightened than I had ever been in my life. but I was more frightened of quitting than I was of dying. So I did the only thing I could think of. I kept flying. Chin's eyes had filled with tears. She blinked them back and came to attention. Thank you, sir. That is the answer I needed to hear. Walter nodded. Use it, Colonel. The next time you are in a situation where everything is falling apart and every instinct tells you to give up, remember that fear is not the same as defeat. Remember that you can be terrified and still keep flying. Chun held her attention for a moment longer, then relaxed. She extended her hand. It has been an honor to meet you, sir. An honor I never expected to have. Walter took her hand and shook it firmly. The honor is mine, Colonel. You and your team, you're the ones who took what we built and made it real. Made it matter. I just laid the groundwork. You're the ones who fly the missions. Chin smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her professional demeanor into something warmer. We will keep making it matter, sir. I promise you that. She stepped back and turned to rejoin her team, who had gathered near the demonstration aircraft. Rebecca watched her go, then looked at her father with an expression of quiet wonder. You really do not understand, do you? She said softly. You really do not see how much you mean to these people. Walter turned to face her. I did a job. I did it well. But I was not the only one. No, Rebecca agreed. But you were the one who did the impossible. You were the one who refused to quit when quitting was the only rational choice. That matters, Dad. That matters more than you know. She took his hand and began leading him toward the VIP area, where a vehicle waited to take them off base. And now you're going to come home with me. You're going to meet my husband. You're going to sleep in a real bed. And tomorrow, we're going to start figuring out the rest of your life. Walter allowed himself to be led. His feet moved across the tarmac, past the security barriers, past the spectators who watched with knowing smiles. Behind him, the F-35 gleamed in the fading afternoon light, a testament to what he had built, a legacy that would fly long after he was gone. But for the first time in 7 years, Walter Jameson was not thinking about legacy. He was thinking about home. 6 months had passed since the air show. Walter Jameson stood at the window of his daughter's guest room, watching the morning sun climb above the tree-line. The room was small but comfortable. A real bed with clean sheets, a closet with clothes that fit, a bathroom where hot water flowed at the turn of a handle. Luxuries he had once taken for granted had become miracles. The first weeks had been difficult. His body, accustomed to years of deprivation, had rebelled against regular meals and consistent shelter. His mind, conditioned to constant vigilance, had struggled to accept safety. He had woken in the night more than once, disoriented, reaching for a doorway that was not there, preparing to flee from a threat that did not exist. But Rebecca had been patient. Her husband, David, a quiet engineer who worked at the same Lockheed Martin facility, had welcomed Walter without hesitation. They had given him space when he needed it and company when he could tolerate it. They had learned his rhythms and adjusted their own. The VA had come through on their promises. A caseworker named Sandra, a Navy veteran herself, had shepherded Walter through the bureaucratic maze with a combination of persistence and genuine care. Medical evaluations had revealed the expected issues: malnutrition, cardiovascular strain, the accumulated damage of 7 years without proper health care. But nothing that could not be addressed, nothing that could not be healed. The psychological support had been harder to accept. Walter had spent decades solving his own problems. Asking for help felt like weakness. But the therapist, a retired Air Force psychologist who specialized in veteran trauma, had understood. She had met Walter where he was. She had not pushed. She had simply listened. Slowly, painfully, Walter had begun to talk. About Margaret. About the grief that had consumed him. About the years of self-imposed exile and the twisted logic that had kept him from coming home. About the guilt he still carried for abandoning his daughter when she needed him most. The talking helped. Not immediately, not dramatically, but incrementally, like ice melting in spring. The weight he had carried for 7 years began to lighten. The darkness that had swallowed him began to recede. He was not healed. He understood that now. Healing was not a destination. It was a process, a daily choice to keep moving forward, to keep trying, to keep flying. The door opened behind him. Rebecca appeared, dressed for work, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "You are up early." She crossed the room and stood beside him at the window. "Old habits." Walter smiled slightly. "I still wake at dawn. Probably always will." Rebecca nodded. She had stopped trying to change his routines. She had learned that some patterns were too deeply ingrained to break. Instead, she had adjusted. Early breakfasts together before she left for work. Evening walks when the weather permitted. Small rituals that rebuilt the connection they had lost. "I have something for you." She reached into her pocket and withdrew an envelope. Walter took it, frowning slightly. The return address bore the seal of the United States Air Force. "Open it." He slid his finger under the flap and extracted a single sheet of paper. The words blurred for a moment before coming into focus. An invitation to Edwards Air Force Base for the formal rededication of his photograph in the Hall of Honor. Not as a memorial to a dead pilot, as a recognition of service from a living legend. The ceremony was scheduled for the following month. General Morrison would be there, General Howard, Lieutenant Colonel Chun, and the demonstration team, representatives from Lockheed Martin, engineers and pilots and support staff who had worked on the program across 3 decades. "They want to honor you properly," Rebecca said softly. "They want the world to know that you are still here." Walter stared at the invitation. His hands were trembling. "I do not know if I can do this." The words came out rough. "Stand up in front of all those people. Accept recognition for something I did so long ago." Rebecca took his hand. "You do not have to decide today, but I want you to think about something." She waited until he met her eyes. "For 7 years, you convinced yourself that you did not matter, that what you did was worthless, that you deserved to be forgotten." She squeezed his hand. "This is a chance to tell a different story. Not for them, for you. A chance to stand up and accept that your life has value, that your service has meaning, that you deserve to be remembered not as a ghost, but as a man who made a difference." Walter was silent for a long moment. Through the window, he watched a commercial airliner trace a white line across the blue sky. Somewhere up there, pilots were flying aircraft that benefited from systems he had helped develop, innovations he had tested, protocols he had written in sweat and fear and determination. His legacy was still flying, even when he had tried to abandon it. "All right," he said finally. "I will go." Rebecca's face broke into a smile. She wrapped her arms around him and held him tight. "Mom will be so proud of you," she whispered against his shoulder. She always was. Walter closed his eyes and let himself be held. He thought about Margaret, about the life they had built together, about the years he had wasted running from her memory instead of honoring it. "I know," he said softly. "I think I am finally ready to believe it." If this story moved you, if it reminded you that second chances are possible, that heroes walk among us in forms we might never expect, please subscribe to our channel. And right now on your screen, you will see another incredible story waiting for you. Click it, watch it, and remember that every person you pass on the street has a story. Some of them might just be legendary. Thank you for watching. They stood together at the window as the sun continued its climb. Father and daughter, survivor and searcher. 2 people who had found their way back to each other against impossible odds. 1 month later, Walter Jameson stood in the Hall of Honor at Edwards Air Force Base. His photograph hung on the wall beside the legends of American aviation. His name was spoken with reverence by pilots who had studied his techniques. His hand was shaken by generals and engineers and young cadets who looked at him with wonder. He wore a new flight jacket. The patches were fresh, but the pin on his chest was the same one General Morrison had pressed into his palm 24 years ago. Worn smooth by years of handling, carried through shelters and streets and 7 years of exile. A reminder of what he had done, what he had survived, what he had finally allowed himself to reclaim. Rebecca stood beside him, her hand in his. David stood on her other side. Around them, the aviation community had gathered to honor a man they had thought was lost forever. When it was Walter's turn to speak, he stepped to the podium and looked out at the assembled faces. Pilots and engineers, veterans and active duty, families and supporters, all of them waiting to hear from a legend. He thought about all the words he could say, the technical achievements, the flight records, the innovations that had shaped a generation of aircraft. But in the end, he said something simpler. I spent 7 years believing I did not deserve to be here. His voice was steady, carrying across the silent hall. I convinced myself that grief had erased everything I had accomplished, that my failures as a father and husband had canceled out my service as a pilot. He paused. I was wrong. What we do matters. The sacrifices we make matter. The people we love and the people who love us, they matter most of all. I lost sight of that. I let darkness convince me that I was worthless, and I almost let it destroy me. He looked at Rebecca, but someone refused to give up on me. Someone kept searching when I had stopped believing I deserved to be found. And because of her, I am standing here today. Not as a ghost, not as a memory, as a father, as a veteran, as a man who finally came home. The applause that followed was not for his flight records or his technical achievements. It was for something more fundamental, something human. Walter Jameson had come home, and he was never going to disappear again.